I'm Jim Salicrup. I'm the editor-in-chief of Paper Cuts, a company that is dedicated to publishing great graphic novels for all ages. But perhaps people know me better for the 20 years I spent at Mighty Marvel Comics, editing everything from Spider-Man to Fantastic Four, Avengers, X-Men, you name it, I probably edited at some point or another. Probably even wrote a few books, had a long run writing Spidey super stories, but I also did things like the Transformers and a few other comics like the A-Team and Sledgehammer and Kool-Aid Man. I could go on and on.
As far as my side goes, Transformers is the favorite.
Why, thank you. Yeah, well, I sort of lucked into that.
It was the first comic series I actually started collecting.
Well, the cartoons, the toys were super popular, and I just happened to be available at the time. I think the original writer was Bill Matlow, and he wasn't able to continue after the first issue, which he plotted the first and second ones. Ralph Macchio scripted the first one. I took over with number 2 to 3 and 4, which was all it was ever intended to be, was a mini-series. Then they kept it going, and Bob Budiansky, who was my editor, and was also the guy who was coming up with a lot of what their powers were and what their names were. So it made sense for him to continue. I was an odd choice because to this day, I still don't drive a car, so I'm the least mechanical person in the world. So why I should be writing about robots that turn into cars is beyond me. The first thing I did, the first one I plotted, in order to make it something I could write, I immediately guest starred Spider-Man. So I figured he was like my character, that I could, enter their world and see it through Spider-Man's eyes. So that was a lot of fun.
Spider-Man was there was a S.H.I.E.L.D. cameo.
Oh, you were paying attention.
So they didn't name him, but they kind of alluded to Godzilla.
Well, yeah, there was Nick Fury and Dum Dum Dugan were referring to, if you look on that same page, I think there's a truck going under a bridge, which was US 1, which was another comic Marvel was publishing at the time. Very obscure cameo. You really have to be paying attention to find that one. Yeah, well, I hide things everywhere.
So how'd you get started comics?
That could take all day, but in a nutshell, I was very lucky. I was a kid growing up in the Bronx. I loved comics. It's funny, here we are at a comic book convention, but when I was a kid, comic book conventions were very rare. Any kind of comics-related events, if there was 1 or 2 a year, that was a big deal. Now in New York City, there's sometimes, some nights, there's like 4 events in one night. But I was so in love with comics, I wanted that to be my life. I would read everything I could to find out about comics, read lots of interviews with artists and writers, particularly the artists. As you can see from my lousy sketches, I'm a frustrated cartoonist. But I went, and so what I did is I went to the High School of Art and Design, because I read a lot of the top artists went there. And a year before that, when I was just 14, I submitted some of my lousy artwork to a magazine called Kids Magazine, and it was co-edited by someone named Jeanette Kahn, who later went on to become the editor-in-chief and president of DC Comics. At age 15, I had to retire because that was the age limit. The magazine was for kids by kids. So after having that little bit of success of just sending in some submissions to a magazine, I figured, well, what do I have to lose? I'll send a postcard into Marvel. I said, I'll be your slave. And it was like winning the lottery. I actually got a response. The post.
I could use a slave.
Well, Sal Brodsky was the guy who was sort of the production manager and was looking at the bills and trying to keep, costs under control at Marvel. This was in 1972, before FedEx and the internet and all that stuff. So the way they would send the actual comic book art to the printers was through the U.S. mail. And normally they, throughout the 60s, they only had a certain amount of titles. In the 70s, they really started expanding, and as a result, they started falling behind schedule. And in order to get the books to the printer, they first had to go to the Comics Code Authority. And in order to save some time, to avoid running late, they started using a lot of messengers to send, the material. Saul noticed, they were spending a lot of money on messengers. Roy Thomas, who I sent my postcard to, said, here's a kid who wants to be a slave. Saul was more than willing to take me up on my offer, but I think Roy insisted I get paid. And Roy's philosophy, which was pretty enlightening because Marvel was kind of a short-staffed company, is that everyone they hire for any position, it would really be helpful if they know something about comics. If they just hired a regular messenger, he'd just be sitting there waiting, to deliver the next package. With me, I could erase pages, run errands, whatever was needed, and if someone had a little knowledge of comics, that's what I had, a little knowledge of comics. I was able to be helpful. So I got hired at the summer of '72, before I even went into high school, and I think I stayed at Marvel for 20 years. I finally left in '92, and about 8 years ago I started Paper Cuts. And as I said, when I was just 14, one of the things I did was erase the pencil lines on the original art. At Paper Cuts a couple of years ago, we hired this guy, Stan Goldberg, who is one of the original Marvel bullpenners. He colored all the original Marvel superhero costumes, came up with the color schemes, and did Millie the Model with Stan Lee for many years, worked at Archie Comics for 35 years. And, we were so thrilled to be able to hire him because with all his experience at Archie, he knows a lot about clear, easy-to-follow comic book storytelling, which is exactly what we like at Paper Cuts because we appeal to all ages. But it's almost like Stan is still working in the 60s in that he doesn't have, he has a computer, but he doesn't have a scanner. And after 8 years at Paper Cuts, the first time I actually touched physical artwork again is when Stan sent in his pages and I had to erase them. So after 40 years in comics, I'm still erasing pages. That's my whole career. A professional comic art eraser.
What inspires you to create Paper Cuts?
Well, you work for other companies for years and years, and I really loved it. Marvel, after 20 years, I felt I learned all I could there. I bounced around a couple other companies. First, I went to the Topps company and started a line of comics for them. Briefly worked for Stan Lee again out in California at Stan Lee Media as his senior story editor. And, it's always a thrill to work with Stan. But part of me was just looking to, not necessarily be just an employee anymore because, then your fate is, not so much your own. Whereas if you have a company, not that that guarantees anything, it's probably the riskiest thing you could probably do. But I was lucky enough to run into a guy named Terry Nantier, who very successfully has had his own independent comics publishing company called NBM, publishing great graphic novels, doing some of the first great, comic strip collections of classic comic strips, a lot of European material, great European comics translated into English. He published that here. But the thing that really impressed me the most about Terry is that his company's been going, independently for over 35 years. I'm just someone who likes to plant myself down and just work, and we both agreed there was sort of a big gap. There wasn't any companies really focusing on very young readers or girl readers, and everything we've been publishing is addressing, that audience, because it seemed like the big companies at the time we started in 2005 weren't all that interested. Now, with the success of titles like My Little Pony from IDW or Lego Ninjago from Paper Cuts, which are literally best-selling titles, now the big companies are, amping up a little bit more and doing comics. So it's great, and it's great to be at this particular convention and seeing so many kids, So I grew up with those kind of comics. You know, it's funny when people hear the phrase all ages. You know, I grew up, when I would go to the newsstand, everything was mixed up together. You know, there wasn't like a kids comic section, a teen comic section, a middle-aged comic section. It was all there, and you could really sort of like, it was like a buffet. You could say, oh, well, maybe I'll read Casper the Friendly Ghost this month, but I'll read the Fantastic Four and maybe X-Men, Batman, or Jerry Lewis, or something from Archie, or Gold Key, or Charlton. I mean, I really like that kind of variety. Since the 80s almost, it's almost like the majority of comics were superheroes, and to a lot of people, when you mention comic books, that's all they think of. It's superheroes. I love superheroes. You know, I worked at Marvel for 20 years, but I felt, you know, someone has to come up with comics for someone like that. And that's what Paper Cuts chose to do. It's 8 years later since we started. Sales are great. We're doing very well. We're getting a very positive responses from kids, from schools, from libraries, from parents, and even a few comic book fans who are able to tear themselves away from their superheroes and read some of the books we publish.
One of the things interesting, Paper Cuts started putting out the Smurf comics. You picked up Magic Flute and the actual first appearance of the Smurfs. And with that, what was your decision to translate the Smurf comics?
Well, to me, it just seemed insane that the Smurfs were this, is literally a comic series that's been around since the 50s and been available everywhere else in the world except really the United States. And I grew up, and Tintin has always been around. You know, people keep talking about, oh yeah, Will Eisner started graphic novels, but before A Contract with God, I was going to my local bookstore, and there was Tintin and all the Tintin books. When I was a kid, there was something called Children's Digest. It serialized Tintin. There was even an early morning cartoon show when I was a kid with Tintin. So Tintin, to me, although it came out much earlier than the Smurfs, I always admired that, wow, this is something that it didn't have to do a whole song and dance and convince people what graphic novels were. It just was what it was. It was sold in bookstores. And it seemed to me the Smurfs were something in its own way just as good and just as exciting and just as well done. And like, it was like a dream. Like if our little company could get something as well known, as popular as that material and be able to publish in the U.S., I personally, you know, was desperate to. I can't read French, so it's the most self-indulgent thing in a way that I could do is to find these comics that I'm curious about and publish them in English. That way, I could read them. And what we found is in the comic book stores, it became our biggest seller because I think a lot of the kids who loved the show in the 80s are now older and are curious about the source material. And exactly, the movie came out, created a lot of awareness. So the comic book stores did really well with the Smurfs. We were doing really well in the kids sections of bookstores, which is where most Paper Cuts titles are. But I thought, like, you know, there's probably more adults who would probably be interested in the Smurfs books as well. But unless they have kids, they're probably not checking out the kids section of their bookstores. So we launched a new title this year, the Smurfs Anthology, which was more or less repackaging, you know, make at a larger size, you know, the size the comics were originally published in Europe, several volumes in one book. And we're going to be doing a lot more of the Johan and Pee-wee stories, which, in Volume 2, the story we're publishing, the Smurfs only appear on 4 pages. That's not something I could have gotten away with as a single Smurfs book. I think kids who want to see the Smurfs would be disappointed. But the point is, we published this, we got it into the regular graphic novel section in bookstores, and before the second movie came out, the book already sold out. We're going into a second printing. almost every Smurfs volume we've published has already gone back to press several times. So it's just one of those things where the question is not why did we want to publish it, but how are we so lucky that no one was publishing it for all these years? I think back in the 80s, a few volumes were published in English, but it was by a book publisher who I think looked at it only as a TV tie-in. So they figured, you know, with something like that, it's a fad, they'll get in, they get out. I looked at it as something that this is like a perennial, you know, a classic comic series that should be in print forever and ever, or at least as long as there's still print. We have it available digitally as well.
Were you kind of surprised some of the content? Some of the stories are actually political commentaries, like, you know, arguing over which were the Smurf.
Well, that's sort of a parody of an ongoing issue that exists in Belgium to this day. You know, like, and you can even see similar things happening, like say in Canada and Montreal, where people are arguing what the official language should be. So I think the point of that story was just to point out the absurdity of it, and but there were other issues like the King Smurf, which was a great political satire, in many ways kind of inspired by Hitler's rise to power, which is you know, pretty serious stuff when you think it's you know, a children's book, but it's one of these things that it works on several levels. That's why we say the books are for all ages. To a kid, it's just fun and adventure. To an adult who could look a little deeper into it, they'll find a lot of interesting stuff served as the inspiration for the stories.
Yeah, some of those stories were actually adapted into the normal differences. A lot of differences from the episode.
Well, you know, definitely the cartoon show was aimed at younger kids. It was done in the 80s. There was a lot of censorship. Certain issues, I'm sure, the networks or the censors wouldn't want to have dealt with in a cartoon show. Like in that Johann and Pee Wee story that'll be in Smurfs Anthology #2, one of the big issues, believe it or not, is alcoholism, and that was completely taken out of the cartoon show. You know, which makes sense. You know, but I think that there's nothing offensive about, you know, Peyo's books. He handled it all very seriously and intelligently, but still, it's all just fun, and it's the Smurfs. You gotta love it.
Are you planning to ever do the Johann Pee Wee books?
What we're doing is running, our first step is to run all the ones that feature the Smurfs in the Smurfs Anthology, and if it goes well and we get through that, then I think we might just be able to continue running the rest of them in the Smurfs Anthology as well. We're running Benny Breakiron as well, which was a book that Peyo created in the 60s, early 60s, that was sort of his version of Superman, which is interesting, you know, in light of the recent Superman movies. And, you know, this year or last year was the 75th anniversary of Superman. In many ways, Benny represents sort of, or is inspired by the very early Superman, who was a lot simpler, more human character. The current Superman, excuse me, is more of in some ways, more of an average modern superhero, in that he gets more involved with cosmic scale villains, and in some ways, possibly he's lost a little bit of his humanity and charm or humor, which was in the very early Jerry Siegel stories. And I think if people read Benny Breakiron, one of the things they'll see is that humor and charm and innocence of this very heroic character who really does stand for truth and justice, but he's French, so not so much the American way.
Dazzler.
I remember
That's a character that just can't get any momentum.
Which are my favorite stories.
ComiCONN.
More of where they came from.
What?
Yeah, no, we're hoping to publish as much PAO material as we possibly can. So I'm happy it's been going over as well as it has. I mean, when we first started doing the Smurfs, we had no idea how well it would do. I was at a book fair in Miami, and people looked at, oh, what are you doing with that old has-been property? But once the marketing kicked in for the new movies, everything old is new again. So, and still, I think a large majority of Americans still think the Smurfs were a 1980s cartoon property, and that our comics are based on the cartoons, and it's a never-ending, battle to tell them that no, the cartoons were based on these comics.
You also started doing the Power Ranger comics. The first time they got Power Rangers Zeta. What do you guys start doing?
Well, like we were talking about superheroes, and generally we're trying to avoid doing superheroes, but I think what made us want to do Power Rangers is that they were very specifically superheroes created for a very young audience. And so the feedback we got from a lot of particularly comic book fans, particularly older comic book fans, is they didn't care for the more recent incarnations of the Power Rangers. We started with Super Samurai, and we have Mega Force Power Rangers. Kids today are interested in that, but the older audience seemed very, very interested in Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. So at San Diego ComiCON, we were able to announce we're going to be doing all new, never before told stories of the original Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. So we're very excited about that, and we're hoping that some of the older fans will be interested in that as well. Yeah, no, they're very. I don't think one of the reasons I think Saban decided to go with us is because they looked at what else we're publishing, and they saw that we're very focused on all ages material, and they weren't interested in seeing a dark and gritty version of the Power Rangers, and and that's pretty much the way we are with most of the titles we publish at Paper Cuts, is that we want to be very true to the source material. If it's an existing property that's been around a long time, we don't want to necessarily change it. We want to take what's good about it and try to capture that as best we can in the comics format.
Is it tough trying to tell stories when they're doing? They have like the huge storyline. How do you write a story that doesn't go against what they're doing in their show?
Well, I mean, they're involved on every level. So even when we, the very earliest point, when it's just a plot outline, it has to be approved by Saban and the story editors on the Power Rangers TV shows. So if we're doing something wrong, or which I don't think we have ever done, but if we were, they would guide us in the right directions. And they're very helpful. The thing about Power Rangers is, just like Marvel and DC characters, they have a really long history, and the fans that are into it, pay attention. So you just can't have anything happen. Even though on one level it's very simple, straightforward stories, on another level it's a lot of complexity to it. Like things only work if certain Rangers are together in a certain formation, etc., etc. You can't use this Zord unless you do this, and so and that's something that's important. We want the fans of every property we're doing comics of to feel like we get it, we understand the characters, and we're not doing something wrong.
Because we do notice these things.
Well, the good thing about the modern digital age of publishing is that if we do have a successful series and we go back to press, if the fans tell us and spotted any mistakes we made, we're usually able to fix it in the new printing. So I wish I could say we were perfect, but occasionally little mistakes do slip through. But the good thing is we do get to fix them.
Has he gotten to the second question yet?
Actually, we're on the last question. Do you have any advice for anybody who would want to get into comics?
Aside from reading Danny Fingerot's book on how to write comics, because I think that really covers. It's a tricky thing. I mean, the best advice I ever heard for artists came from an artist named Jim Steranko, who I was a big fan of, and he said, "Be so good they can't afford not to hire you." And in terms of actual useful advice, I feel that's actually the truth. I mean, there's lots of artists, they may have a lot of potential, but when they show their work to editors, you know, the editors like have their choice of professional artists. Why would they suddenly take someone who may not be ready yet? Yet if someone comes with a portfolio and the artwork is just so good it blows the editor away, the editor feels compelled, I better hire this artist before someone else does. So unfortunately that's a tricky thing, you know. So much of any kind of art, commercial art, comic book art, is purely subjective. So what one editor loves, another editor may hate. Tastes change. I suggest that artists, writers, try to be true to themselves. You know, try your best. Try to, you know, anything you can to get your work in front of the people you want to see it. But you know, there's all sorts of options that didn't exist before, of putting your work online, self-publishing, doing it digitally, and the advantage of doing that is you own your own material, you know, and if it becomes a hit, you know, you'll benefit from it, as opposed to, you know, don't give anything away to big evil comic book companies. You'll regret it. But if you just want to work on their characters and write your favorite character, there's nothing wrong with that, except there's a lot of competition, and it's not that easy. A lot of other people want to do that as well.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.